You're listening to Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self, a podcast about wilderness Christian mysticism. I'm Stephen Hatch, your host, a contemplative living in New Mexico and a former faculty member at Naropa University. For over 45 years, I've been living an intentional lifestyle, combining family life with silence, meditation, and solitary time spent in the great outdoors. Along the way, I've developed an outlook rooted in Christian spirituality, informed by the world's great mystical traditions, and inspired by the wisdom found in nature. This podcast is for kindred mystics, lovers of nature, and people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious. It's for those who are turned off by the oftentimes bigoted attitude of pop Christianity, yet who want to discover the deeper mystical tradition that is expansive, inclusive, and liberating. Please join me as I explore the vast landscape of this contemplative tradition. Today I'd like to talk about how we might use spaciousness or spacious awareness to ground us in troubling times. As we all know, our nation and really the world is going through troubling times right now. And this crops up periodically in our lives. And so the question is, how do we find a grounding in the midst of all of that? I've found that spaciousness, spacious awareness, is especially important in helping us to become grounded so that we don't get carried away by our troubled thoughts and emotions and the events of the day. My first contact with spaciousness really was when my dad used to take us on vacations to national parks in the West, especially in Colorado and Wyoming. Growing up in Pennsylvania, we didn't have much wide open space. It was mostly forest. But coming out west, I suddenly had a sense of wide open expanses, a sense of hope, a sense of optimism. So much so that I decided I wanted to move here at age 17, straight out of high school, and go to school here and then live in the West. And I have ever since, first in Colorado for 44 years and now in New Mexico for the past 5 years. Another way that I encountered spaciousness was through a certain singer from Colorado who was singing when I was in high school, and that of course is John Denver, especially his songs about the West, Rocky Mountain High and others. In his early style, he had a tendency to extend and sustain notes at the end of phrases for what seemed like an infinity of time. And that gave a sense of a spaciousness. It wasn't that he was just talking about and singing about the wide open spaces, but that he was actually embodying it with those extended notes that seemed to carry on for an infinity. My next contact with spaciousness was really in studying Buddhism in college, especially Tibetan Buddhism. Buddhism talks about a thing called shunyata, that is at the root of all reality, and it often gets translated as emptiness. But in the West, of course, we tend to have a nihilistic feeling when we think of emptiness, and so I found it fascinating that Tibetan Buddhists translated shunyata as more of a spaciousness. And you think of the Tibetan landscape and of those wide open mountain expanses. And so the Tibetan Buddhists talked about spaciousness as the fundamental root of reality, and that when we identify with spaciousness instead of with our thoughts and emotions, we find liberation. So an example would be two Tibetan teachers, Nyakpa Chogyam and Khandro Dzogchen, who say this: the practice of meditation introduces us to a new dimension of ourselves in which we can find a sense of spaciousness. When we relax and loosen up enough, we begin to discover space. When we allow our thoughts to arise and dissolve, we discover that without commenting on or becoming involved in them, we discover that the thoughts have space around them. This is not an empty space. It's not merely an absence of thought, but a vibrant emptiness, a spaciousness which is in itself pure potentiality. We can discover that all thought and indeed all phenomena arise from and dissolve into this spaciousness. For they all arise out of that spaciousness, and that's a constant theme in Tibetan Buddhism, is that everything, all phenomena, all thoughts, and all feelings, all arise out of that spaciousness and then subside back into them. I think also of an insight meditation teacher named Sharon Salzberg, who talks about watching a play in a crowded city theater that has a lot of drama, a lot of anger and fear and lust and all kinds of emotions. You feel like you're crowded and almost up on the stage because the space is so small. And so you feel quite engaged in that play of emotions, and it can get kind of depressing. She said, well, what if you take the exact same play and you instead watch it at the Santa Fe Opera, which is near here. I live in Taos, so it's just within an hour of here. Instead, there's the wide open New Mexico sky with the layers of orange and peach and pink that come at sunset. And there's a sense that you have the same play, but it's all happening in a wider space. And so it doesn't seem so solid. It doesn't seem so leaden. It doesn't seem so claustrophobic. So that's exactly what we do in meditation, where we use the out-breath and perhaps an image of a spacious landscape, and we identify with that spaciousness and allow our thoughts and feelings to arise like echoes out of that spaciousness. And so we find a liberation in that spaciousness and in identifying with it. Pema Chodron, the great Tibetan Buddhist teacher, calls it mixing mind with space. So I wondered a couple decades ago, what about the Christian mystical tradition, my tradition? Where is spaciousness found there? So I went on a search and I found quite a few passages. First, I found that Dionysius, the Syrian mystic of the 6th century, reminded us that even though we can't conceptualize what the divine essence is, in itself, we know the place where it dwells. And so he talked about the dark cloud, he talked about the abyss, he talked about that sense of being surrounded by night, and that the presence is with us, and that we are held, and that we are gripped by it, even if we can't see it. Well, I discovered that many other mystics also talked about the place of God as being spacious, like the sky, like the ocean. So, for example, way back in the 6th century, St. Gregory the Great, he said that the minds of those contemplating are enlarged in themselves to a great breadth. They become more spacious within. In the very light of the intimate vision, the inner reaches of the mind are opened up. It is so expanded in God that it stands above the world and stands above itself. It is enlarged in its interior. And we think of Gregory living during a time when there was quite a bit of plague, and he found this spaciousness, the place where the divine presence dwells, as a liberation where he could find something that was more grounding than the disease and the sickness that was all around him. Another person who talks about spacious is the 4th century desert father who came from the area where my grandfather was from, Asia Minor or Armenia. And he was one of the desert fathers, and he talks about this spaciousness in different terms. For example, he says, when the nous, mind, having stripped off the old self, has become reclothed with the new self that comes from grace, then it will see its own state at the moment of prayer, like the color of sapphire or of the sky, what the scripture calls the dwelling place of God, which was seen by the ancients on Mount Sinai. He says, if you wish to see the transparency of your own spirit, you must let go of all thoughts, and then you will see yourself looking like sapphire or the color of heaven. He says this is a kind of formlessness, and he tells us happy is the spirit that attains to perfect formlessness at the time of prayer. So he describes this spaciousness, this interior spaciousness, as being like a sapphire sky. Yet another Christian mystic is Saint Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century, and I love this, being a hiker myself. I love his description of God being a hiker within the human self in this passage. He says the radiance of the soul is clearer than mountain air because of its transcendence. What a capacity the soul has, not only to receive the divine presence, but to be able to make sufficient room. What can I say of her who can provide avenues spacious enough for the God of majesty to walk in? She is to become heaven, the dwelling place of God. So the soul must grow and expand that it may be roomy enough for God. Its width is its love, and then the width, height, and beauty of its soul will be the width, height, and beauty of heaven itself. In this heaven, the one who is supreme and immense and glorious, God, is not only pleased to dwell, but to wander far and wide on its pathways. So our own inner spaciousness becomes an intriguing landscape that the creator of the universe is excited to hike within. Later, Meister Eckhart in the 13th century, the German mystic, talked constantly about the divine presence as a breadth without breadth, expanseless expanse, a solitary wilderness into which no distinction ever peeped, a vast wasteland, and a still desert. And a disciple of his says this, "O intellect, the road leads you into a marvelous desert, so broad, so wide, it stretches out immeasurably." A little later, Hadovich, a Beguine mystic who lived in the mid-13th century, wrote of this vast inner desert also. She said the poor in spirit must live without notions in a vast simplicity. It is without end or beginning. It's one that is boundless and without limit. In this wild, wide simplicity live the poor in spirit. Nothing is there except emptiness, ever answering to eternity. A later mystic who used the Beguines and Hadovich as inspiration for his own thought, John Ruysbroek, a Flemish mystic, he says this, "The union with God is one that is without ground, infinitely deep, infinitely high, and infinitely long and wide. In this very manifestation, a person's spirit realizes that by means of love, it has itself been immersed in this depth, raised to this height, and sent forth into this length. It feels itself to be wandering in this breadth, living in this unknown knowledge." So here again, we have this sense of this wide open space that is in the domain of the inner self. Then in the 16th century, St. John of the Cross, he said that this mystical wisdom will occasionally so engulf a person that he will have the keen awareness of being brought into a place far removed from every creature. He will feel he's been led into a remarkably deep and vast wilderness, into an immense unbounded desert. The more delightful, savorous, and loving, the deeper, vaster, and more solitary it is. Then in the 20th century and the late 19th century, we have John Muir, who continues the tradition when he says, "I will fuse in spirit skies. I will touch naked God." He talks about going into the unbounded ocean of never-changing love. So there is this sense of this wide open spaciousness in which we find liberation. And indeed, John Muir found liberation from his strict fundamentalistic father when he came west and came to the Sierras and later to Alaska, where he found the wide open spaces to be liberating. I'd like to say a word about Howard Thurman, who was a black mystic. He was a spiritual advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. He grew up in Daytona Beach, Florida during the segregation era, and it was quite challenging. And so he found early on as a boy that he was take his boat out into the bay, out into the ocean, and he would find a sense of spaciousness. He says, the ocean and the night together surrounded my little life with a reassurance that could not be affronted by the behavior of human beings. The ocean at night gave me a sense of timelessness, of existing beyond the reach of the ebb and flow of circumstances. He says, I was held, and the experience of these ocean waves gave me a certain sense of immunity against much of the pain which I would have to deal with in the years ahead, when the ocean was only a memory. The sense held, I felt rooted in life, in nature, and in existence. And so then he would later write that this ocean put him in touch with the inner ocean, where he felt he was transcending all boundaries and all horizons. He said it was the beyond dimension that saves the individual life from being swallowed by the tyranny of present needs, present hungers, and present threats. This is to put distance within the experience and to live the quality of the beyond, even in the intensity of the present moment. So there was this sense of a spaciousness, and he talked about it as an inward sea. And so he could say that there is in every person an inward sea, and in that sea there's an island, and on that island there's an altar, and standing guard before that altar is the angel with the flaming sword. Nothing can get by that angel to be placed upon that altar unless it has the mark of your inner authority. Nothing passes the angel with the flaming sword unless it be part of the fluid ocean of your consent. That is your crucial link to the eternal. So he got this sense that there's a place within that he could retreat to that was spacious, and that nothing could harm all of the racist attitudes of those around him, and all of the difficulties that he would face could not touch that inner center. And he called it centering down, in fact. I love it because Howard Thurman is a mystic that really matters in our time. He wasn't just off in a monastery like a country club, but he lived in the midst of the difficult time in the 60s of the civil rights movement and the other challenging movements. And he became a mystic out of necessity to find that inner space. Well, I live in a place where there's quite a bit of wildfire in the Rocky Mountains. In New Mexico here, in 2022, we had the Calf Canyon Hermit's Peak fire, which was the largest and the most destructive wildfire in the history of New Mexico, and it burned 341,000 acres. And so I remember the billowing smoke that I could see from my backyard, and it took quite a long time for the firefighters to put it out. But 2 years later, I went hiking up toward a place called Serpent Lake near Mora County, and I passed meadows and meadows of wildflowers among the burnt trees. There were blue columbines and red Indian paintbrush, purple larkspur, and violet-colored asters. And it was amazing to see the profusion of wildflowers. And wildfire and the burn that comes afterwards and the bloom that comes afterwards always remind me that there's always hope after a devastating time. In our own time, we might feel that devastation, what's going on in our own country and in the world. And I'm reminded of the poet Rumi, who has these lines. He was a 14th century Sufi mystic. He said, I burn away, laugh, my ashes are alive. I die 1,000 times, my ashes dance back. 1,000 new faces. So I know that when we practice spaciousness, meditation, insight meditation, and we identify with spaciousness instead of with the tightness of our thoughts, our ego momentarily burns away like the wildfire does, and we can identify with spacious awareness instead of with our troubled thoughts and emotions. So when we identify with this spaciousness, then we see our thoughts, emotions, and events as primordial echoes of a divine love and longing, no matter how twisted by human foibles they are, a love that dwells at the root of these events and these thoughts and these emotions. When we uncover that love, then, as Rumi says, the ashes dance back. It's as though the spaciousness is giving rise to a breathing room that helps us decide our next course of action, so that positive thoughts can then arise, and it's though the ashes suddenly produce the wildflowers that dance back. But we have to have that burning of the ego, as Rumi talks about, to enter into that spaciousness. We let go of the tightness of the thoughts, because ego really is a constriction. It is a constriction of spaciousness. So how do we let go of ego? Not by trying to get rid of it, but by relaxing it, like opening a hand up so that it becomes open to receive. So we become this spaciousness then, and then we can see our thoughts and emotions as echoes arising as though out of nowhere. As you know, I teach a wilderness insight meditation in which we label each thought echo, echo, and are amazed as it arises as though out of nowhere. It's as though the great mystery, the Creator, was about to speak a word of love into the cosmos, and before he could speak it, lost himself into the spaciousness of the mind and heart of the contemplative and of the wide open spaces of the wilderness. And nevertheless, echoes of that never spoken word arise anyway. So when we identify with interior and outer spaciousness and allow the landscape around us to become a mirror of that spaciousness, then we can see our own troubled thoughts and emotions and the events of the day as echoes that have divine love and longing at their root, even if they're twisted by our own foibles or by leaders who are authoritarian. We can find that there is something at the root. We can rest back in the spaciousness out of which all arises and look for the root of the divine life in everything. In many cases, that root of the divine life is asking us to help. It's asking us to do something to be able to put things back into order. It's asking us to let go of those troubled thoughts and to find a sense of hope. The first president of Stanford University, David Starr Jordan, he lived from 1851 to 1931, famously said, "Wisdom is knowing what to do next, and skill is knowing how to do it, and virtue is then doing it." I like this quote because it implies that wisdom only shows us what to do in this next moment, not in the next and the next and the next. So when we enter spacious silence, we seek to hear what the still small voice of the Spirit within us advises us to do next. And I suppose in the current crisis, most of us haven't moved beyond this point. We're still doing, as the Quakers say, we are holding all things in the light. And knowing what to do next and how to do it, and then to do it, will reveal themselves in due time. But it takes this sense of spaciousness to listen to the still small voice of the Spirit within, who simply tells us what to do next. At this time, it may be simply to grieve, it may be simply to listen and to ask, what is our next course of action? And then to listen and realize, well, the next action may be to listen. And then it will be revealed what we can do in the next moment. We don't have to think far into the future and worry, but only think about what we are called to do next. So I think it's important for all of us to develop this spaciousness as a groundedness in which somehow our thoughts and feelings and the events of the day can fade into the background like echoes. As I'm looking across now out my dining room window, I see far to the west the mountain peaks glittering. I see the snow and the crows flying, and I know that those crows echo out of the Rio Grande Canyon that is just a few miles in front of me. I get a sense of spaciousness in the landscape that mirrors the inner spaciousness that I seek to embody during these troubling times. And so, during this time, I would counsel us all to live in that spaciousness, to see our own thoughts and emotions as echoes of a primordial time that get twisted into the afflictive emotions and whatever these leaders are doing that is troubling. But to be able to seek that spaciousness, that then creative thoughts, creative echoes might come out of that spaciousness, and we might know what to do next. So until next time, I hope you can practice a degree of spaciousness, return to your out-breath whenever you forget, and find a centeredness that we all need to face these troubling times. Until next time, I hope that you have a restful living in this spaciousness. Goodbye. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please let me know by liking, commenting, and sharing it with others. If you have a question you'd like answered, or would like to pursue one-on-one spiritual direction, you can write to me at natureasbeloved@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at natureasbeloved. For daily photos and quotes, you can follow my personal Facebook page or go to Instagram at the Stephen Hatch Outlook. And for more information about my books, you can find them on Amazon's Stephen K. Hatch author page. Until next time, may you continue to walk in beauty, be well, and stay wild.